Welcome to the Popcorn Talk Network, for the online broadcast network that features movie discussion, news, and interviews. Press 1. Popcorn Talk. We talk movies.
Hello, fellow film fans, and welcome back to another historic Hollywood watch along. As always, follow the Popcorn Talk Network on the internet, youtube.com/Popcorn Talk Network, and on Twitter at Popcorn Talk. I am Lex Michael, all over social media at the Lex Michael, and I am here with
Carie Bible at Film Radar on Twitter.
Byron Lee Thompson at Byron Lee on Twitter.
So at the behest of one of our producers who suggested to us, why don't we do a show on John Cassavetes? We are jumping a little further in the timeline than we normally focus. Cassavetes' work was primarily 60s, 70s. But we're going to take a look at John Cassavetes' work on our next full episode. So today, for our watch-along, we are looking at Faces, which is his fourth feature film as writer-director, the second that he made himself, and we can talk a little bit more about that as we get into the movie. To that point, let's get into the movie. If you have your physical copy, your streaming copy queued up, I'm going to count us all down, and we're going to hit play at the same time so you can watch along with us. All right. Are you ready? 3, 2, 1, play. And we're going. We're looking at the Criterion Collection logo, as I assume many of you are, being that Criterion handles the rights and distribution for the bulk.
I think it's the only way Faces is available. So
yeah, it's the bulk of his filmography at this point.
This is shot in Super 16 millimeter. High contrast film.
So, right away, something that I wanted to talk about, and I know we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail when we do our full Cassavetes show, but what is interesting to me about the way he makes movies in general, and it's exemplified very specifically by his first movie, Shadows, which was 1959, I believe. That entire movie came out of a series of acting improvisations that he did, and he essentially built a movie around these characters that came out of improvisations he did with these actors. Now, the movie Shadows, the finished movie, it still says on the end of it, you know, what you have just seen was a collective improvisation. And in fact, that was true for a version of the movie, which was released, I want to say, in 57. But it was not received very well, was extensively reworked before its release in 1959. And the version of the movie that most people are familiar with is pretty thoroughly scripted. But it does retain a very loose, very improvisational feel. And I think you see that reflected in certainly this movie, but I think it's something that he continues throughout the bulk of his work.
Well, I think one of the more interesting things about Cassavetes, what you were talking about some of his earlier work, is he had this overwhelming desire to try to go for the truth.
Yes.
So by shooting this on Super 16 and by shooting in black and white and always financing the films himself, he seemed to always be trying to offer a tonic for the studio movies that he was always involved with, getting money to do these type of projects. I was thinking, even though you were listing the other films he did, this is kind of the first film that he did that got a wide release. Is that not correct?
I believe it is. I'm sure someone on the internet will correct us if we are mistaken on that point. I mean, it was the first one he did that was his.
Right.
Because he did Shadows, and then he went and he did Too Late Blues and A Child Is Waiting for studios. But those, I mean, I think are widely considered to be footnotes at this point in his career. And then in 68, with Faces, he, I would say, reemerged as the Cassavetes most people are familiar with. And yeah, he makes some very, as far as the aesthetic choices that he makes, some very anti-studio polish type aesthetic decisions. From the way the movie was shot to the very, very loose improvisational feel of it to some of his casting choices. I mean, you know, we've seen in this opening the actor John Marley playing Richard Frost,
right,
and just his appearance. I mean, you look at how just how pockmarked his face is, for example. You know what I mean? Like, he's not the type of actor that a big studio production would cast as their lead.
And the reflexive use of the title playing into the film as if we're kind of like a film within a film, much like The Player and some of the other things that uses this reflexive thing. Nobody had really been doing that at this time. He seemed to be kind of a pioneer of that, even though, like you said, his films were lesser seen maybe than a lot of this stuff. But I find that very interesting because it goes back to the whole stage thing, which of course is a big part of where he came from. And at the time you were saying, like, nobody's ever really seen a movie like this. This was not the norm.
Absolutely not the norm. And he's working in an era. I mean, there's an almost 10-year gap between the release of the final version of Shadows and Faces almost 10 years later. This was 1968.
Right.
But obviously now you're working well into the 60s. You're looking at the New Hollywood era. You're looking at a time in which, typically on our show, we're looking at movies made prior to this period in filmmaking, because this decade marked a total revolution in the way movies were approached, both in their making and in their reception. And I think there were a lot of filmmakers who were challenging traditional notions of what film was, could be, should be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So as we were talking about, I think the way Cassavetes' movies, especially a movie like Faces, the way it feels almost pointedly and specifically and intentionally artless is very, very interesting. Because it does feel like you're watching actors playing scenes, and you know that you're watching scripted pieces. Things that are very clearly and meticulously constructed, but the feel of his movies is such that, if you don't know John Marley, if you don't know Gena Rowlands, if you don't recognize Seymour Cassel, who shows up later, you would be forgiven, I think, if you stumbled upon this movie for saying to yourself, oh, this is a really strange late 60s documentary film about these very odd, directionless people. And even, the movie he made after this, Husbands, I think it's a little bit more difficult to fully buy into the reality of it, if only because your three leads are Ben Gazzara, Peter Falk, and Cassavetes himself. But if you weren't familiar with any of their work as actors, if you didn't know their faces, I think you'd be forgiven there for making the same assumption.
I think that the truth that he's trying to get to also is kind of referenced later by filmmakers like Jim Jarmusch. And I think we were talking to Kevin about Richard Linklater,
Yes.
who did Slacker.
Absolutely.
Some of these ideas that, like you said, in the 1968, the film's about to change forever. This was really, I think in a large way, especially by cinephiles, very much ignored as being kind of like an experiment. Because it just really didn't, like you said, the popularity wasn't there. I mean, that is what you were saying, right, Lex?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you completely, and I think were it not for other filmmakers, people like Jarmusch, people like Linklater, who found Cassavetes' work, especially his earlier work, I think it is entirely possible that some of his what would ultimately prove to be his more influential contributions to cinema may well have been forgotten, or at least largely overlooked. But you can look at a movie like this and see stylistically the seeds of what a lot of filmmakers are still doing.
He was married to Gena Rowlands. They made 10 movies together, and he directed her to 2 Best Actress Academy Award nominations also.
Was one of those Gloria?
I think the other one was A Woman Under the Influence.
Sure.
Yes, I believe that's
And this
correct.
past year, she was given an honorary Oscar by the Motion Picture Academy. Actually, a few months ago, actually. I realize this is a wildly unpopular opinion, and I might have people just come after me with pitchforks, but I kind of find Cassavetes' films kind of hard to watch. It's very depressing.
Do you think he does that on purpose by
Yeah,
moving towards that
probably.
stuff? I mean, do you
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that's one of the reasons why he's trying to like kind of push people out of their comfort
Yeah,
zone?
exactly. But if you already have problems with depression and you go into one of his movies, it's just not
not
an
gonna
easy
be
slog
for
for
sure.
you at all.
That's definitely not going to help.
And it's not going to help. And they kind of meander. They kind of are very like Italian neo-realist in some ways.
Because a lot of this stuff is done in real time, and it's
Real
not
time,
like
it's very bleak.
it's not the structure that we're kind of used to. It's like we're kind of watching it, like we're watching our own lives, maybe.
Like if I wanted to see people fight, there's a lot of places I could go and watch that happen.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Sure, you don't necessarily want to be entertained by that. I get that.
Yeah, and also some of the people are just so unlikable that you just think, wow, I'm spending 2.5 hours with this person, and it's just not easy.
But that's
I
a
think that's the point, maybe, but
that's a theme with his work, though, right? I mean,
Yeah,
I'm not
it
as familiar with
is, it
Cassavetes as
is.
some of the other people, but Lex seems
Yeah.
to be pretty familiar as well. But that's kind of an ongoing theme, right? The dark side.
yeah, it's just
And I mean, I completely understand that point of view. This is, even if you look at the movie and say, wow, every element of this is masterful, that still doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to appeal to you as a piece of entertainment, for sure.
exactly. I mean, I would say that Cassavetes is someone that I admire and respect. He's not someone that I enjoy. If that makes sense.
Oh, that makes a
really.
lot of sense. And I would say, even for me, I've been, the fact that we've got a show that we're doing on Cassavetes coming up, I used it as my excuse to finally jump more fully into his filmography. And I'm talking like essentially the entirety of his filmography. And watching his movies, it took me a couple of them. It took me, I think, until I got to Husbands. And I think it was midway through Husbands, something clicked in my brain where it's not something that I can really effectively put words to, but it's like my brain acclimated to what he's doing, or the way that he's doing it. And it's like my brain said to itself, oh, okay, I have to shift slightly, and that's how I watch this, and that's how I get the most out of it. Because, yeah, the first time I saw Faces, it was very... it wasn't a negative experience, but there was a big feeling of, what is the purpose of this scene that's happening right now? The first time I watched this, I was like, this is interesting, I suppose. It feels very much like reality, which is impressive, but what is the significance of this scene as part of a greater whole? And then even the first time I watched it, though, I'd get to a certain point where I was watching this movie and I was having that experience looking at a number of his scenes, but like there'd come a point where, and I didn't even realize it as it was happening, maybe it's just my brain fell into the faux reality that was being presented to me, but I'd come out of this scene going, oh, I found myself weirdly sucked into that by the end. But a lot of it does feel very very meandering at times, and I do think it's intentional.
But you're saying you're kind of a convert because you said that when you got halfway through Husbands that you were kind of like on board.
Yes, absolutely. But yeah, initially, I didn't dislike it initially.
Sure.
Initially, I thought it was very interesting, but it's not, I wasn't, oh, wow, I really, really, really like this. But now, like, like I said, like going a little bit further, something clicked, and now coming back, I find myself enjoying his earlier movies a lot more than I did. And a lot of it, too, is, for example, like Karie, as you mentioned, none of the people in his movies are particularly likable, even if, not even taking this movie specifically, there are other characters who maybe are a little more charismatic on their face, say. But if you think a great deal about how they're carrying themselves or what they're doing, like the actual actions that they're taking, you realize, yeah, they're not the nicest people. But I love, just for example, just as somebody who really enjoys looking at and analyzing performance, like, yeah, these are not the best, most morally upright human beings, but they're played so exceptionally well, and the way that Cassavetes frames these performances in these wider shots and these takes that are allowed to go, and it means the pacing of the film consequentially is slower, but I love watching the actors get to play in a space like that, because you don't see that too much in movies, certainly modern movies, which rely a great deal on extensive editing to shape a performance.
Well, you're kind of an actor to a certain degree, Lex, so maybe that's one of the things that's appealing, but I kind of jump over to where Karie is. I not really seeing that aspect of it. I'm not enlivened very much by the performances. I know Gena Rowlands from other things, and I know
she's so beautiful.
And I know a lot of the people, like you said, but what you're looking for, which sounds fantastic, I don't necessarily see that in the same way. I feel like almost it's just turning on a camera, which may be kind of the point, but to me, I'm not as enlivened by the performances like you were saying. I mean, it may have taken you a while to get there, but like you said, they're not really exciting characters per se.
I feel like a I feel like a fly on the wall. I feel like a fly stuck on the wall in this house, and I'm just kind of watching what's going on, and that's what you're doing. That's the film,
And I agree. I actually agree with both of you on the points you just made. But to me, I'm a little bit excited by that, because even though I believe wholeheartedly that there is a certain element of improvisation present here, to be able to get two actors into a room with scripted scenes and to create a situation where, as an audience member, you feel like you're just watching somebody turn on a camera and watching two people exist, that's actually really hard. That takes quite a bit of craft and expertise and ability to make feel like you're a fly on the wall, as opposed to, oh, they turned on a camera and these are two actors mimicking reality. Do you know what I mean? So like that element of it, I find really that just captures my imagination.
They're gonna sing this like 20 times. I hate to say this also, again, if people get mad at me, that so be it, but you also have to be in a certain mood for these movies.
That I agree with completely.
Like, some days I struggle a little with our show, because there's some weeks I'll think, I'm just not in the mood for cats. I'm in the mood for Groucho Marx this week, and
Sure.
That's what my mood is calling for. So sometimes it's like I'll just have to sit down and be like, you've got to watch, and even if I know ultimately it's going to be interesting or enlightening or whatever, it's just sometimes it's hard to get myself in the proper mindset to go there,
Well, even if you're a big fan of Cassavetes, I feel like, you know what? It's like a Sunday afternoon. I want to throw on something entertaining. Yeah, I'm gonna put on Faces. I feel like that's not the one that comes up. I feel like, yeah, you watch Cassavetes to watch Cassavetes, and if it's not that's not the one you pull off the shelf on a whim to watch on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Maybe it is. I don't know. For some people, I'm sure it is, but I absolutely appreciate that point, because it is definitely like his stuff. He's definitely a filmmaker that you have to definitely be in the right mindset to watch. But I also think, and not Cassavetes specifically, but the style in which he makes movies, and there are certainly other filmmakers that have adopted a similar style. I just think it's something that if you're not used to it, it's something you essentially have to teach yourself how to watch. Much in the same way that I think a lot of young people have to teach themselves how to watch movies that were released earlier than 1960. I think you just have to train your brain a little bit. And like this moment too, where what was this happy upbeat scene of frivolity completely turns on this moment of ugliness that, yes, obviously it's a moment that is contrived in as much as they wrote this into a script specifically to create a turn in the scene, but it feels to me just as real, just as authentic as all of the moments that preceded it. This feels to me like, yeah, like maybe not in these exact circumstances, but I feel like everybody has had an experience where you're with a friend and the friend maybe says or does something that is on its face a little bit ugly, and suddenly everybody's not having quite as good a time as they were a minute ago.
So would you say that might be what he's going for with his films, by trying to share the uncomfortable moments that maybe we all go through?
Yes, I would. I mean, I certainly can't directly speak to what his exact intentions were, but
But clearly you felt uncomfortable when this took its turn. I'm assuming something like that's happened to you?
Yeah, I'm sure. I think maybe certainly not, like I said.
Maybe not at that level, but
or exactly the way it's
I mean,
happening.
the way that everything changes. Like you said, they were all singing and having a great time, and then suddenly the tone.
And it wasn't right, and it wasn't a big, dramatic. I mean, yeah, it turns into a shouting match, but the turn wasn't a big, dramatic.
It was very subtle.
Right, it wasn't a big cinematic thing. It was something very, yeah, like you say, subtle's the perfect word, or something very small.
It was very commonplace. It was just a conversation.
It was organic. That's the word I'd use. In watching this, because it's been a few years, it kind of, to me, harkens back to the Italian neo-realist movement after the war.
Yeah.
And also, too, the kitchen sink, the angry young man films of England in the 1960s. In film school, we'd watch so many movies, and you study movies from like the very beginning of film until the present day around the globe. And there's certain genres and certain people you just don't get to because there's so many hours in the day. And for some reason, I really didn't get to a lot of the kitchen sink films. And a few years back, the Egyptian ran a ton of them. And I went and saw The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner and To Look Back in Anger and Sporting Life and all these incredible movies. And I think this owes definitely a lot to them as well, both in look and in style. I think that sets them apart, though, is the Angry Young Man movies tend to have much more of a structure and a story with plot point and things happen, and this one just feels more free floating, and I think that's, to me, the big difference, at least that I notice.
So in those films, because of the structure, you're kind of locked into where you're going, whereas this, basically anything can happen.
Exactly.
And that's not, you don't really care for that very much, from what you said earlier.
It's
I don't think I care for it either.
I
I was
mean,
just, you were using the British movies. To me, I was just thinking about a lot of the movies from the 60s that are, dramatic stories. This isn't really a dramatic story. It's like you said, you're the fly on the wall. And, that can be okay, but maybe not so great also.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's frustrating. The very first time, I think being willing to revise or reconsider opinions is a totally important thing.
Sure.
And the very first time I saw Kubrick's 2001, I absolutely hated it. And I remember sitting there going, okay, when the hell is the plot going to happen? When is something? I just remember being so like, God, that was such a waste of my time. Just being very disgruntled by that experience. And then a few years after that, after hearing several of my friends rave about it, I thought, well, I must just be missing. So I don't know. I'm willing to open my mind, and I'm willing to kind of reconsider the whole thing. So I saw it for the second time on the big screen, which I'm very lucky to get that opportunity. And I actually found myself being more drawn into it and really being, but I think the second time around, I knew what I was getting into. The first time I didn't. So I think I was expecting okay, and this happens, there's certain plot points, and it wasn't like that. And I think I felt so like, okay, well, all right, very frustrated with that experience. But the second time, I knew what I was signing up for. I knew it. And I actually found myself being drawn into it. So,
But not so much with this. Not being drawn in the same way.
It's hard. I don't know. Like I said, Cassavetes, I respect his work a great deal. I admire it. But it's hard for me to enjoy. It's hard for me to lose myself in it. It's hard for me to emotionally kind of engage, if that makes any sense.
Is it because of the realistic approach? Because it doesn't really have that
Because I
cinema
love
feel?
documentaries.
Sure.
I mean,
Sure.
But I definitely, I think, Karie, what you were just saying about your two different experiences with 2001, I think definitely speaks to, not that I think it would make you do a 180 on Cassavetes, but I think as a general concept, yes, I could not agree more with the idea that reevaluating, reappraising your own opinions, very important.
yeah, yeah.
But also, I do think it's very important with a lot of filmmakers, certainly not just Cassavetes. I mean, 2001's a perfect example. I think it definitely helps to know exactly what you're getting into before you get into it. Because if you don't, I feel like Faces being a perfect example, if you don't know going in that you are basically going to be a fly on the wall hanging out with these characters for about 2 hours in a movie that is essentially plotless,
Yeah.
you're gonna come out of this movie going, what the hell was that?
And there's some movies like the kitchen sink movies. I was with a friend of mine at one of them, and she looked at me and she said, "This isn't working. Let's just get up and leave." And I turned to her and I said, I don't drink wine, but I think some movies are kind of like a bottle of wine. Like you got to let it breathe
Sure.
before you. And I told her, I said, let this movie breathe for a little bit. Just let it, and I think it's going to pay off. And then it totally did in a really great way. But this is the kind of movie where it breathes and breathes and breathes, but you don't feel the payoff of any kind, emotional or otherwise. Maybe.
I can see that. I can definitely see that. And I do think even if you do feel the payoff, it's not there. I don't think there's really an aha moment in that sense.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
I think just based on the way we've been talking so far, I may and both of you disagree, please, but I feel like I may be the biggest Cassavetes fan sitting on this couch currently.
You are.
Yeah.
You are.
Totally fine. But
I love his acting. I'm just not so big on his directing.
But for me, it's like there, like I said, there really is not an aha moment in as much as there is you don't come out going, oh, this was the big point. But what I'm fascinated by is this idea that, everybody, all of the characters we encounter in this movie are unhappy for one reason or another. And many of them don't even realize that they're unhappy or how unhappy that they are. And the movie certainly does not offer a solution or really even much of a sense of resolution to this existential quandary that all of these characters are in. But it suggests maybe that even being able to identify that you are unhappy is, if not a solution, then the point. Or if not the point, then that's... Well, I'm trying to think of the best way to put it. Even the understanding that you're unhappy is significant. And I don't know, maybe that seems overly intellectual or too intellectual to be emotionally satisfying in any way, and I could totally see that. But
I think as a director, especially the way that John Cassavetes is kind of structuring things, I think you're his audience. If that's what you're getting out of it, and that's what you're seeing, I mean, that's what he's trying to communicate. I think the reason why I don't necessarily enjoy it, kind of like what Karie was saying about the fly on the wall, is, Jim Jarmusch and Richard Linklater and a lot of these stylistics that kind of came out of this Cassavetes thing. I feel like the tone and the materials, everything, I'm not as passionate about this stuff. It seems like you've seen a lot more Cassavetes than I have, but I've seen more of his later stuff, like The Killing of a Chinese Bookie and Gloria, and I was always curious as to how he got there from here. But you've seen a lot of that stuff. You said you saw Husbands, right?
yes,
And you like that.
I did. And Husbands is one that I think right up at the top, we mentioned because it starts with the Criterion logo.
Sure.
Criterion has the rights to, they released a box set, re-released it on Blu-ray pretty recently, but they've got Shadows, they've got Faces, they've got Woman Under the Influence, Killing of a Chinese Bookie, and I want to say Opening Night,
Okay.
maybe. because Criterion Collection doesn't have, say, Husbands, for example, I feel like Husbands is one that maybe doesn't get, at least in the conversations I've had, not that I go to taverns and hold court about Cassavetes frequently.
You know you do.
I can see that.
Byron saw you last week.
I can totally see that.
Don't BS us, Lex.
But
Taverns.
I fit taverns. Oh yeah, not bars, sir.
I like to know we were in colonial times. That's awesome. Hanging out at the tavern.
The old tavern.
That's right.
But I feel like Two Husbands just isn't quite as accessible, let's say, as some of the other ones. But I watched it and I figured, okay, this will be maybe a little bit easier, if only because, you know, I know all three of the leads. As I mentioned, it's Ben Gazzara, it's Peter Falk, and it's Cassavetes himself. So it's like, okay, I know these actors, I have a general feel for their screen presence, and maybe that will make this idea of what I'm assuming, again, will be largely fly on the wall hanging out with these guys, make it even more palatable to me. And I can't say for certain that I think that's what helped, but it was when I got to Husbands, because I haven't seen the two movies that he made between Shadows and Faces. But as I said, it was about probably halfway through Husbands where I just went, okay, yeah, I'm just hanging out with these guys. And it's a similar type of non-plot movie in that there really isn't, unless I missed it, an aha moment. It's more the discovery and the understanding of your own lack of satisfaction with your station in life. And I don't know, something about that, I don't know why, just tickles my brain.
Well, you know, I actually, before I was waiting in the lobby before we started shooting this, I went on IMDb and I was just kind of reading comments. A lot of people felt Cassavetes is kind of polarizing. There are definitely a lot of people, it's like, genius of the American cinema, and other people they're like, okay, maybe so, but, you know, so there's definitely, I don't think Byron and I are totally alone in the...
I don't think you are at all.
In the opinion here.
And this is certainly, again, it's like, even if Cassavetes is your guy, and yeah, okay, I maybe am the biggest fan of the three of us, but I certainly wouldn't say Cassavetes is my guy. But even if he is, I don't think you can really argue that his movies are, I mean, it's, your pulse is not going to quicken watching Husbands, you know what I mean? They are, to me, I think, a lot more intellectually stimulating even than emotionally stimulating, which, yeah, it doesn't always make for a particularly, let's say, revelatory cinematic experience, because I do think people in general go to movies to feel things. And I definitely can see if a movie is making you think a lot more than it's making you feel, and there isn't at least a happy medium in that sense, yeah, it's definitely, you could argue, well, you're not really telling a cinematic story, I think. But it's even the way this relationship is played, the back and forth between this husband and wife, Richard and Maria, it's John Marley and Lynn Carlin. It feels, and maybe this is part of why it doesn't feel quite so cinematic, but this feels like two people really having a fight, but specifically two married people, because you watch over the course of the scene these peaks and valleys in their conversation. 1 second they're crazy tense, and then because there is a familiarity and comfort between these two people that have been married for such a long time, they very easily lapse into laughing with each other. And then just as quickly somebody makes a comment that maybe it shouldn't. I know what sparks Richard, or Dickie as he is affectionately called a number of times in this movie, what sparks him to finally make the comment about wanting a divorce is that Maria makes what seems on its face like a totally innocuous comment about things being seen from a woman's point of view, and that just sets Marley's character off, and it just feels so genuine. Like, you don't know why he's reacting that way, but you know there's something in the relationship of these two people that is informing every moment of it. And the way it does flow organically, like I said, those peaks and those valleys and the conversation and the argument feels so authentic to me and so without artifice. But again, that's not going to be everybody's cup of tea.
And again, I think too, one thing about evaluating movies is where you are at in your life when you see them.
Yes.
Like there's some movies that I have seen when I was younger and I was in a different place in my life. And then I see when I'm older, I see totally different things in that movie. I feel emotions, I think different things. I look at it through a totally different lens. So, I don't feel the way I did back in film school. You know what I mean? It's like there's so much time that has passed, and so I think it depends. It depends on your mood, and it also depends on, again, where you are in life.
Absolutely.
And that has a heck of a lot to do with how you see a movie.
She said earlier to him that she was not a sex machine. Is that what she said? Wasn't that one of her lines, Lex?
Something to that effect, yes.
But he said that he wanted that distraction when he comes home because he doesn't want it to be work.
Right. Which again, like that, if coming home to your wife feels like more work, I feel like that's a red flag or should be a red flag. But again, that plays back into sometimes just realizing that you are unhappy in your situation is a massive step.
Of course, this came out, what, 69?
This was
68.
68.
Okay, 68. Well, the feminist revolution was in gear, you know, so I think there's looking at that through that lens as well of, you know, the roles of women changed and the status quo for women changed in society around that time. Anyway.
this idea that he rather flippantly tells his wife that he wants a divorce, and then immediately proceeds, first well within earshot, and then as the scene progresses, right in front of her face, has a telephone conversation with Jeannie, who she doesn't know is a prostitute, but this other woman about, yeah, what are you doing tonight? And then walks out, just leaves his wife there. And yeah, Richard, maybe not the nicest person.
One thing I love about movies is what they tell us about ourselves, and especially at different points in time. And I like seeing this bar. These people are all so nicely dressed. The women have on cocktail gowns and pearls, and guys have on suits. And you wouldn't see a scene like that in a bar today. It's a very different time.
It definitely would feel, if you were to see it in a modern film, it would definitely feel very out of place.
Yeah.
I do think too, like especially once you get into a scene like this where you're just in an environment, you're just following Richard around this bar, and you're looking at John Marley, and you're looking at you're just looking at the guy. Like I mentioned at the top of the movie how he is a very non-traditional actor to cast as a lead in a movie, especially around this era. But despite the fact that he is not, he's not, let's say, matinee idol in appearance, he is very striking. I mean, I feel like, at least for me, it's like when I see him moving through the crowds at this bar, like in a shot like this, you see what's happening in the foreground, and he's not necessarily the focus of the shot, but you see him, and then your eye is drawn to him because he does have a very striking look. There's also this running theme of feeling intensely alienated in this movie, and I think that was something, once you got into the 60s, you certainly started to see more of as a recurring
Sure.
theme in cinema than you ever had before. But just seeing Richard wandering through that bar, being completely surrounded by people, but very clearly being connected to none of them. Seeing Jeannie here, seeming on the surface more connected to the people she's talking to, but of course she's a prostitute. These are Johns. There really is no genuine connection here.
Right.
Even the wife, Maria, who goes out later and goes out with her friends, meets Seymour Cassell's character. There is a surface level connection there, but it's only surface. There's no genuine connection being made. And I think Faces, the title, maybe refers to this concept of this superficial connection, this face that you put on for other people that masks how deeply alienated you are.
Well, I like when the scene when the husband tells his wife he wants a divorce. She never says anything. Just the way that camera kind of lingers on her
And he even
face.
asks for an answer, and she still doesn't respond.
I think it's great. It's kind of like acting without words, which is one reason I love silent film so much, is you don't always need them.
Right.
In fact, sometimes it's more effective when you don't have them.
Yeah, I agree.
Do you guys hear a bunch of weird background noise in the lobby, or is it just me?
Oh, that happens all the time.
Oh, okay. I just didn't know.
Yeah, and if the title Faces 2 refers to the notion of putting a face on to appear, if not connected, then certainly I feel like everybody, to one extent or another, even if only for an hour a day here and there, I think sometimes you do feel like you have to say put a face on to go and be a part of the world. But there are moments, and it's these moments where scenes turn, and in certain writings about the movie, they refer to that as moments where these masks slip off, and the moment where the friend, Dickie's friend at the beginning of the movie, asks Jeannie to name her price. That is the mask slipping off. The Dickie himself saying to his wife that he wants a divorce. That's another such moment. There's one coming up here pretty soon where one of these Johns is gonna out of nowhere say, what the hell do we care about two whores?
Right.
These moments of uncomfortable reality, which then I think feed into not just the increased sense of alienation of the people that are on the receiving end, but also I think speak pretty profoundly to the feeling of alienation that is felt, but maybe not necessarily identified within the speaker, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Hey, Lex.
Yes.
I think I have to take a break. Is that possible to do on this?
If they can hear us in the booth, is
Yeah,
that
what's up?
possible?
I have to step out for a second.
That's fine.
Can we pause? We cannot pause. That's all right. We're going to keep going. It is. And as we discussed, it is not the. It doesn't move along at a brisk clip. I think it's interesting too that clearly both Richard and Jeannie are now decidedly on the receiving end of the abuse of these two Johns, but despite being both on the receiving end of this, they're still not connected to each other. And there are times where it seems like Richard is trying to make that connection and he is continually being interrupted. But then you have moments like this where he just seems so almost defeated. Almost, he almost feels like an extraterrestrial surrounded by a species that he just doesn't quite know how to communicate with.
He's cast adrift.
Yeah. And it's like he really doesn't seem to understand this feeling.
Gena Rowlands is so beautiful, though. She's such a great actress. I mean, to me, if for no other reason, the thing to watch about Cassavetes movies is to watch her. You know, I mean, she's just really fantastic.
I don't know if you all said anything about this while I was taking my break, but I noticed that alcohol plays a pretty large role. Is that a typical Cassavetes thing, since I'm kind of learning as I go along?
In the films of his that I've watched, yes.
Well, there's a lot of anger.
Well, I do believe he died of alcoholism, did he not?
Cirrhosis
I think
of
cirrhosis
the
of the
liver,
liver
I
at 59
believe.
years old. Yeah.
But maybe you've seen more than I have, Karie. Is that like a key part of his stories? The alcohol being a part of the.
Um,
Because I noticed she was making the 2 drinks when he asked for the divorce, and then poured out the one. And
I think part of it, maybe that, Lex, you can speak more to that. Maybe a part of it's also the culture.
of the
And
time,
this
you
was
mean?
a time
Right.
when you
like
had
you,
a
like
couple.
you were talking about the bar and how it's not like that anymore.
The Mad Men world. I mean, this is a world
Right.
you have a couple martinis with your lunch and you go back to the office. I mean, this is the time when,
It's typical.
yeah. What do you think, Lex, about how the role alcohol plays in his other movies?
Well, I agree with that part of it entirely, but I also think too, especially, I mean, like just using this as an example, if we're gonna continue with the thought that this idea, these faces we put on to create if not a connection, then certainly an environment of societal pleasantness and acceptability. Alcohol certainly, on top of the role that it plays as a social lubricant, obviously lowers inhibitions when consumed in the quantity that these characters consume
And heightens emotions. They get more volatile or more erratic.
which leads pretty directly to all of the moments that we see in this movie where those masks slip away. It tends to be when they have imbibed quite a bit of alcohol and are feeling these strong feelings of alienation and disconnectedness, and yes, suddenly they're speaking from a place that they don't even realize is there a good deal of the time, and sometimes what comes out is very, very ugly, and sometimes it's very, very poignant. But I think alcohol is, in the context certainly of this movie, is a tool in a sense that gets these characters to a place of very raw, uncomfortable, emotional honesty. But of course, that does reflect very much the culture of the day.
Well, I was for years I was an alcohol and drug counselor in Pasadena, and I know that sometimes we have triggers that trigger our problems, so to speak. And I don't think anybody that I know could watch this movie just because there's triggers almost at every turn, because they drink so casually, like you were saying, Karie. It's just part of the life, part of the style of the day, so to speak.
And the smoking, too, by the way.
Oh yeah, I forgot
Again,
about that.
part of that as
I
well.
forgot about the smoking. You're right, they're all smoking too.
And I do think, too, piggybacking on what we were just talking about, a lot of the characters in the Cassavetes movies that I've seen who are experiencing this a very similar sense of being completely adrift, feeling alienated, feeling disconnected, maybe not even being aware that something is wrong, but like deep down knowing profoundly something isn't right and not being able to address it or deal with it effectively. I think there is a tendency, not just in these movies, but I think in reality for a large number of people, when you deal with all these emotions and you have absolutely no idea how to qualify or address any of it, in lieu of a healthier outlet for all of this stuff, I think some of these people, their behavioral patterns have a tendency towards self-destruction a little bit. And I think you see that certainly in this movie. There are too over the course of the movie a number of instances where a character will make a revelation or will display a certain amount of vulnerability that I think speaks to the greater thematic intent, perhaps, but also doesn't, I think, distinct from these specific points that get referred to a lot as the unmaskings that I referred to earlier, in that, they don't completely stop the scene. They arise very organically. And a lot of people in critical analysis of this movie, and those moments in particular, suggest that there is a very autobiographical element to a lot of those moments, if only in as much as, well, it's twofold. A lot of those moments feel very much like their origin is in the world of an acting class, which we know is where Cassavetes and his entire artistic approach evolved directly from. There's an exercise in a lot of acting classes where two actors will be playing a scene, and at the drop of a hat, they'll be told to continue to play the scene, but on a dime, just completely change their emotion, like completely change their emotional state, and continue playing the scene in this entirely new emotional state. And a lot of these moments where a scene completely turns in this movie feel a lot like that. But also, a lot of people have suggested, just in a more broad sense, a lot of those moments, very clearly in the context of the movie, represent a character pretty emphatically deciding to completely bail on this unspoken social agreement between people. Like, this is the way you behave societally and socially. And a lot of people, when analyzing this movie, draw a direct parallel between that, as presented here, and also Cassavetes' own reaction, his own balking at what might have been considered the quote-unquote norm as far as the career path that he took. Because it seems like he had an opportunity when he was emerging as a filmmaker to have something a lot more in line with what I guess we would, or certainly people at the time, would consider to be a traditional filmmaking career, and decided he didn't want to do that. He essentially bailed on it completely, just dropped it, and decided, no, I'm going to do exactly what I want to do. I'm going to do it my way. And so, beginning with Faces too, and shortly thereafter, he set up a company called Faces International, which would essentially be an umbrella under which he could create and distribute movies completely on his own, independently of any studio. And, a lot of people are familiar with Cassavetes, the actor. He appeared in a number of roles in film and television, but almost exclusively in the interest of being able to then go off and make movies like this.
So, Lex, you were saying that there's an aspect of this that's autobiographical from Mr. Cassavetes' point of view?
Yes. Well, I would think just as far as a general ethos.
Hmm.
I wonder if this is his house, he and Gena Rowlands' house, because it doesn't look like a soundstage. You know, it has that feeling of that it's really someone's home.
No, I think you're right. That seems like a Cassavetes thing, too, to make it even more real.
And Cassavetes, too, was known to have talked about, as far as his intention in the way he told some of his stories, certainly. He talks about how he really felt a need for characters to analyze love. He went so far as to say that was all that he was interested in, was love and or the lack of love, which is certainly uh, I would say maybe the prevailing theme of Shadows, his first movie, but you see a lot of that here as well. I mean, mixed in with the themes of alienation and how we are expected to behave in society versus the underlying reality of our, our emotional state moment to moment. I think that's absolutely true because while there is no real plot to speak of, ultimately this movie is about the way these two people are responding to the potential dissolution of a marriage. And all of these would-be connections, these fleeting moments where two people are able to feel connected, whether or not they truly are, I think speaks to a very human desire for some version of love, and not even necessarily romantic love, just, I keep using the word, but just that feeling of connectedness with another person.
I don't know, Lex, what you said about the love thing. I'm not so sure I get that intent, but I know what you mean.
It's definitely not as pronounced here as it is, I would say, in Shadows. I think there are other thematic concerns he's maybe more interested in exploring here, but I think
Right,
ultimately,
because we're not talking about looking at a romantic love. We're talking about a love that's over time. That's why I thought it was so interesting when he obviously declared that he wanted a divorce, because that's a type of love that maybe isn't alive for him anymore. Not that this is love, of course, because what did he say? He wanted to play around with her for a while, something
sure,
like that.
right.
But there's a lot of subtext.
And this too, when you see Maria going out with her friends, because we've spent most of the movie with Richard up until now, but you see Maria going out, and this I think is the first time you really see the youth counterculture movement of the 60s jut into this world that Cassavetes has been showing us up until now.
Well, it's like they're both trying to escape so much.
And it's this big, like this vibrance. It's so alive with music and people laughing and dancing everywhere. And it's this world that, yeah, like Byron, like you say, like they're both trying to lose themselves in a sense. But this world is a world that is so alien to them, like is so far removed from, as I said, not just the world of the movie as we've been shown it so far.
Because
but also,
of their marriage, you mean? Or do you mean because of the fact that they're dissatisfied with each other?
I just mean this is so the world that we've seen these two inhabiting up until this point. There's nothing like this.
No, in other words, in both places, they're in a better place at this point. He seems to be happy with her. She's with her friends. It seems like a more joyous, celebratory type of mood, so to speak.
On the surface, yes, but of course, I think the underlying truth, is that they're both still just as adrift as they were.
Like you said earlier about the masking, they're masking that then. Their impatience, their lack of happiness.
And there's Seymour.
In your research, Lex, did you find out a lot about how he kind of put together his acting troupe?
Well, I know that you start with Shadows, and Shadows came pretty directly out of working with specific actors to build those characters.
Sure.
You start moving forward. I mean, certainly, like by the time you get to some of his later stuff, I mean, I think once he's a little bit more established, he's able to reach out to maybe a wider variety of people. But you also notice too, like he once he found people he liked working with, I mean, he tended to work with similar people again and again and again. He worked as
Peter Falk and people that he used over again. Like
Ben Gazzara is another one.
Right.
Seymour Cassel is another one. Obviously, as we mentioned, his wife Gena Rowlands is somebody that he worked with again and again and again. And that also, I mean, that feels very much like, yeah, he essentially cultivated a little theater troupe for himself.
But they were friends as well, so it was a perfect fit.
Yeah. And I think that too. I mean, you see, like, I think the level of familiarity, you can feel that when you watch the performances, not just between the actors on screen, but I definitely think too, I don't think you get a performance as authentic as any of the performances, say, in this movie, unless there is a certain level of comfort and familiarity between actor and director as well. And Seymour Cassel is an actor who, is dude has basically, I believe his film debut was in Shadows. And, Cassavetes cast him over and over and over again, and he's a dude that has essentially never stopped working since then. I mean, I want to say he's 81 now, but he's got credits as recently, I believe, as 2014. But yeah, it was working with Cassavetes that enabled him to launch a broader career. I know Wes Anderson cast him in a couple movies. I know he's in Rushmore. I believe he's in Life Aquatic as well.
He's a great actor.
Fun fact about Seymour Cassel, apparently, and I don't know how apocryphal this is, but apparently Slash, famously the guitarist for Guns N' Roses, was friends with his son when they were growing up, and credits Seymour Cassel with giving him the nickname Slash because of the way that he was always in motion, always moving from one place to another and never sitting still. I don't know how true that is.
Why wouldn't that be true?
I don't know, but that's the story. So, like a number of other Cassavetes movies, there's certainly more than one. I believe there are a small handful of different versions of this movie that exists. I know the cut that has been seen by most people runs just over 2 hours, but there was a version of it that ran, I believe, at least a full 20 minutes longer. And Byron, I believe you mentioned on the Criterion disc for the movie, there is a big piece of the. You said it was the opening.
There's a second disc that comes with this set, which of course we're not going to have the opportunity to look at. That basically supposedly has the original opening that Cassavetes wrote and shot for this film. He thought it was a better setup. It's a lot longer. Obviously, I think it's either 18 or 20 minutes. Maybe it's 12 minutes. I'm not sure, but part of the distribution deal, I guess, prevented him from doing that. And then he thought the way the movie starts now is a much quicker way to get to, obviously, the story he's telling. And I know there was another cut as well, so you're right, there's various versions of this film. This is supposedly the definitive version that we know of.
Yeah, and I believe there was this assumption that once he created what was going to be the final version of the movie, that he just chucked the alternate versions out, that he either just threw them away, destroyed them, but apparently years later, a man by the name of Ray Carney accidentally stumbled upon the longer cut and had it deposited at the Library of Congress, which is how we still have pieces of the longer version. I also think it's interesting, too, that this movie was shot. It was released in 1968, but was shot primarily in 1965. And Cassavetes was in post-production on this movie for almost 3 full years.
No, it was 3 full years because you're right. He shot at Super 16, which that wasn't the norm, and they were going to go ahead and do the 35mm blow-up for the release. But when he started that process, like you said, he was literally in post-production for 3 years because he had to get, I guess, these beats right. He had to get the whole idea right. I know it's kind of complicated to think about looking at it now and thinking this would necessarily be a laborious process of post-production. But I think I read a similar article, and really he was in post for 3 full years trying to really get the right tone. So back what you said earlier about the autobiographical nature, I think that probably plays to that strength, I'm sure.
And I can't imagine how much footage he actually shot, and I can only imagine what those 3 years must have been like, cutting together God knows how many hours of essentially footage that, as we've now discussed a whole bunch, is designed to feel like you're just in a room with a bunch of people. How do you pick and choose those moments? Because in addition to trying to pick the strongest moments in editing, you also need to pick those strongest moments and string them together in a way that doesn't create the feeling of artifice.
Right, and not to undermine the material either, because if his whole thing, like I've always read, was the truth, maybe it takes 3 years to find the truth of what these relationships are as they kind of disintegrate in front of our eyes, but maybe that's difficult to find, especially if you're so familiar with it, like he obviously was. And you said that Husbands was similar to this in tone?
Yes. It's very much about these three guys who there were 4 of them. You see this montage at the beginning of the movie. You see these 4 guys, these married men who are very good friends, and one of them suddenly dies of a heart attack. And so the 3 that are left, the story is essentially very similar as far as these feelings of alienation, wanting to reject what is expected of you societally.
Because they're on their journey too, just like, no disrespect, but there's a journey going on here, but you're saying those gentlemen are on that journey as well.
Yes, it's presented differently, but ultimately I think the thematic concerns are very, very similar.
Gotcha.
And in that case, it's these 3 guys impacted by the loss of the 4th of their quartet, trying to figure out, well, what is the purpose? Is there a purpose? I'm, addressing that they're not particularly satisfied with the lives that they're in, to one extent or another, and then choosing to one extent or another, effectively reject their role, their station, this set of societal expectations and obligations that comes along with their station.
Right, I get that, and in this case, we're seeing the separation anxiety, obviously, for both characters, them trying to find maybe their place, whereas those guys are trying to replace what's gone in the other film, The Husbands, right?
Yes. I think there's a lot of overlap. I mean, I think the characters in this movie as well, the Forsts, I think there is, well, and you know what, in both cases, I think, yes, this feeling of trying to replace what's gone, but maybe more specifically, because it does both let's call them existential crises, even if they're not necessarily presented in that extreme of fashion.
Sure.
Definitely are triggered by, in this case, the suggestion that this marriage will dissolve, in that case, the death of their friend. I think it's less this feeling of something that was there and is now gone, more this immediate loss triggered a realization on some level that there was an emptiness that's always been there.
Right.
I would like to thoroughly apologize for dozing off for a bit. I'm sorry, and I'm really embarrassed. Yeah, thank you to our producer, Steven, for discreetly bringing me in a mug of soda, so thank you.
To be fair, if anybody's watching this on YouTube, it won't have been all that discreet. But, hilarious.
It was discreet, or it wasn't?
Oh, no, if somebody's watching, I mean, if you have the visual component, there's just a floating head in the middle.
It's been a crazy week. of work, and then it's raining and cold in LA today, and it's hard to fight that. You know what I mean? I'm sorry. All apologies to everybody.
Oh, no need. It's just, like you said, it's a rainy Sunday. I think we're all a little worn down.
I'm embarrassed.
No, don't be embarrassed.
On camera. Really, Karie? Really? Jeez.
Oh, man. Oh, that's entertaining.
I went to the Sundance Film Festival many years ago, and I have to admit, it was really hard to stay awake because it would be so cold. You'd be standing in snow up to your knees, and then you get into the theater, and they had the theater so hot in there. Like the minute I would sit down, you just it was really hard to stay awake. I know the feeling.
But this is another one of those moments too, which is all of a sudden.
Oh, you mean like the earlier one in the film that everything turned on a dime when suddenly the tone changed?
Yes.
That's what you're referring to,
Yes.
right? It's like that's another one of those kind of subtle moments where things just change.
And it's, this character.
And it's always dialogue. It's always something that somebody says that suddenly everything just switches.
Yeah.
It's like a light switch. It's like everything changes.
And this character that Seymour Cassel is playing, this character's name is Chet.
Is that the second or third time he's been slapped?
Oh, man, I lose count after a certain point.
This must be the place you really want to come.
But this character, too, in that moment, it's like you don't get as much of his POV as you do of the Force or of Genie. But in that moment, too, you get this very strong sense that he, as well, is dealing with, on some level, these same feelings of disconnectedness, of alienation, because he has this moment where it seems like up until that point, it almost seems like, yeah, he's the guy. He's the party guy. Like, that's why they're hanging out with him in the first place. And he's with the
and he brought wine.
Yeah. But it's like he's with the revelry
right
up until he has this weird
revelation where suddenly this is silly.
Right. And we don't know where that comes from, but you get the strong, or at least I certainly get the strong sense that, oh, he's dealing in his own way in a very different world as, say, the Force or Genie, the same feelings of disconnectedness, alienation, this emptiness.
Right, and I got that impression from what you're saying. I felt like it was kind of telegraphed when she asked him where he was from. And I think he said Michigan. He was very uncomfortable, almost like, now I have to be a real person with all of you people.
Right.
It took away all of his fun, so to speak, for a moment. And then he kind of got it back. No, I think you're right.
Slips his mask back on.
Right, exactly. I agree.
That's a great shot with that reflection in the window.
Yeah.
And that shot stands out, too, because that does feel like a more intentionally constructed shot than most of what Cassavetes has been showing us in this movie.
Right, because everything's so free.
Yeah.
That seems like a very connected. You're right.
Well, it feels like a movie shot. You know what I mean? And it's great. It's a great shot, but it definitely stands out because none of this feels like movie shots.
Oh, absolutely. Now, because I'm not as familiar with the talent in this film, the girl that plays his soon-to-be ex-wife, has she done a lot of other stuff, Lex, that I would know about?
Has she done a lot of other stuff that you would know about?
I mean, obviously, I recognize the husband from the Godfather, but I'm not really placing her very well. And I'm assuming you might know more about it than I do, or not really.
Give me a second, and I will answer your question. This character, really quickly though, this character is another example of what I was talking about before. You get a lot of I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase it. Like, this is an example of a character in the movie who is able to show a lot of vulnerability, who's able to take a conversation and turn it without stopping the scene and without making it seem like this person has been wearing a mask the entire time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that was just something that I had alluded to earlier, that there were a number of such interactions.
But I think that's one of the things that he does in this film. He kind of like lays all these landmines out of these characters and lets them kind of explode, like the guy that was kind of calling the guy earlier, like, what does he do for a living, that type of thing. It's like they kind of pop up and become these different type of people to further the story, what little story there is.
Oh, and so to answer your question, this actress is Lynn Carlin, who did a lot of stage work, which I believe would be what brought her to the attention of Cassavetes in the first place. This was her role as Maria in this movie. This was her first feature film. She and I pulled up just to make sure. I pulled up her filmography here real quick, and there's aren't any other titles that jump out to me. She did in '77. She did The Waltons at one point, but no, I think this is probably certainly her most well-known title.
For sure.
But if he'd had gone with super famous, actors, it wouldn't have worked, because to me, you're going to have people that can kind of disappear into the normal person.
Sure.
And if you had someone that was iconic or super famous, it would kind of shatter the whole illusion of what he's trying to say or do.
Yeah, well, and that's what I was saying before too. Once you get to Husbands and the movies he made after that, where he started working with like Ben Gazzara, Peter Falk, people that were recognizable, you definitely can't. Well, certainly a lot harder to sell this is real and not this is a replication of real. But like I was also alluding to, I think it's very, very clear, because the three leads, again, those two actors that I just mentioned and Cassavetes himself, you can feel a genuine sense of friendship in their performances. And that goes a long way towards making up what you lose by casting faces that you might recognize. Because they do feel like three buddies doing this stuff together. This poor woman.
I'm so embarrassed. Oh my God. I'm sorry. It's been one of those weeks. Thank you for bringing me the Coke. That was very sweet of you.
Can we? I mean, if we can just order up stuff.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Lex? I don't think that's what he means.
No, thank you again.
All good, guys. Next week, let's do a 3-hour movie.
Guys. Oh no.
You're good. This is a marathon of a movie, though.
Well, it's not as Gilda is so you cannot take your eyes. You know what I mean? Is this one's not quite as easy a sit. Shall
This
we
seems
say?
like real life. This movie's very realistic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is. It's the way scenes are able to just happen. It definitely. It's not even so much that the movie is that long. It's that the pacing of it is not quick.
In other words, this 2-hour movie is the longest 9 hours I ever spent.
Hey, 30 minutes to go, guys. You got it.
Oh God.
It's going to be fun to talk about it next Friday for Historic Hollywood.
Oh wait, we're doing Friday?
Sorry, next Sunday. My bad.
Okay.
Apologies.
By the
viewers.
way, we're not doing this episode on Oscar Sunday, are we? The 28th of February?
We can figure it out.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
Okay.
When we've talked in the past, specifically as applies to, I think, when we were talking about Gilda, about my disappointment that there are not more musical interludes in modern film. This is not what I was referring to. What we are seeing right now prefigures pretty directly what I would say is not only the biggest example of what we've been talking about as far as a moment where the mask completely falls away and everything turns again, but also I would say the single most dramatic event that takes place in the entire movie. But we'll get to that in a minute.
It's just uncomfortable watching it because you feel like, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, I have the wrong room.
Yeah, like you're witnessing something you're really not supposed to be.
Yeah, that's the whole. I'm sure this is what he intended to create with people's feelings, but it's just embarrassing and awkward. Speaking of which,
That was perfectly timed. I do think it's interesting as well that it there does seem in moments like what we're watching right now, there does seem to be genuine affection exchanged between these two characters, but that's not the answer. That's not what's going to alleviate this feeling, this existential feeling of emptiness completely. And if that's not, then what will?
They're just looking for any answer they can find, when and where they can find it.
And I feel like that does, and again, it's way more of an intellectually stimulating line of discussion, I think, maybe than an emotionally stimulating one, but I think that speaks pretty generally to the human experience. I believe that's from Webster's. Yeah. And in a private moment, like, the mask is able to come off because she doesn't have to put it on for anybody, and then she takes that second when he's calling to her, and she just very minutely adjusts herself. Okay, show the face to somebody again. And like, it's a great, like, what a great performance moment, because you can see in the way that Gena Rowlands is playing it, like, yeah, she's putting on this face, but you can see in the eyes, like, she is dying inside. Again,
no words either.
So this was the moment that I was referring to. It happens off screen, but this super dramatic taking of the pills. The existential emptiness, alienation, disconnectedness that Maria feels, clearly so profound and so without a clear solution that there is a certain attempt made here to just give into it completely and cease the struggle.
Is that saying something about the sexist to Lex? Because if she tries to find herself and is so distraught that she tries to kill herself, he doesn't really seem to be having that same problem. Meaning the other character, who obviously had a wonderful time, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, especially because, and as Karie mentioned earlier in the movie, this was right around the time, where the women's movement was gaining a lot of traction, and this certainly, no movie is created entirely in a vacuum. Especially given the way most of the gender dynamics are handled in the course of this movie, I would certainly assume that there is specific intent there. I do not necessarily feel qualified to speak to what exactly, I think, Cassavetes was intending to say with her having had this experience. I can only
Well, no, but that's kind of why I asked you,
theorize.
because you're younger. So from your perspective, you're seeing we're playing up the guy character, and he seems to be basically ready for another dance. Obviously, like you said, this is a tragic tone shift, and she's obviously at a different place, maybe not able to handle that type of commitment, whatever type of commitment that is. I think it is saying something about that.
And I think too that she is certainly more aware, and I don't think you see it until later in the movie when she has these private moments with the Chet character. I believe she is more aware or feels more acutely this existential emptiness. And I think too
Than he does.
Yes, and I think it's there. It's absolutely there for him. It may be there just as strongly as it is for her. I do not think he is anywhere near as in tune with it as she is.
He seems to deal with his by rage and anger, and she doesn't have that emotion the same way.
And
Well,
oh yes,
men and women handle things differently.
Sure.
And so that could be part of it. Also, the scene's kind of reminding me of, in some ways, of Billy Wilder's The Apartment, where you see a very similar sort of scene with Shirley MacLaine and Fred McMurray. Not Fred McMurray, I'm sorry. I'm spacing.
with Jack Lemmon.
Jack Lemmon, yeah.
It's fun. I would not have made that connection if you hadn't said that, and now that you said it, I'm having a hard time not seeing it. But I do think too, certainly more so in the 60s, I would imagine, than now. I think there's this idea of masculinity where being, let's say, a little too in touch or open with your emotional state was maybe viewed as less what's the word? Less macho, less manly. So I have no problem buying that Richard wouldn't be as open to his own emotional state, or would not be as open to being aware of it.
If you think about it, really, the 60s was probably the most turbulent decade, or certainly one of the most in American history.
Sure.
I mean, all of the stuff that was going on with civil rights and politics and women's rights and just so much turmoil across this country, so much radical shifting of our culture during that decade.
Absolutely.
It was kind of the decade that changed everything. So hard to watch.
It is interesting, though, the way Cassavetes chose to shoot and edit that the repeated slapping of Maria's face, because like we talked about, any time that the technical approach he takes feels more movie-ish or feels more crafted, more constructed, it really stands out. And like you could have it would have necessitated actually slapping your actress in the face a handful of times, but you could have played that in a wider shot. And I think it's interesting that not only is he playing it in super quick close-ups, but for the most part you don't really see the impact of the slap. You feel it because of the way it's cut and the way you see Seymour Cassell's close-ups and Lynn Carlin's close-ups in their reactions. But I just thought that was a very interesting choice that really stands out in the middle of the sequence.
You're right.
It's just hard to watch someone in that kind of agony.
And I like, too, that Chet gives her a cigarette, wraps this blanket around her, and then like has really no idea what to do with himself. So he lights a cigarette and he wraps a blanket around himself. And he has this moment of this, what seems like a moment of real, like, he says, "I really like you," and he did just save her life. It wasn't, the slaps, it's all very jarring, but he did just save her life. The way they're on the couch, his entire ensemble he's created for himself is mirroring hers. This is, I think, about as close to two characters really genuinely connecting as we get, and as we come to find out pretty soon, even that is very fleeting.
As most things are in the film.
And this exchange, the dialogue here, I think, is probably about as close as we get to actually articulating a lot of the ideas at play in the movie. So he comes home, he gets out of his car, he's literally dancing up the driveway.
Handles things a little differently than her, I guess.
For sure. It almost seems like he's been, by this night he's been rejuvenated. I mean, clearly, look, he's literally doing jump kicks as he enters the apartment. It definitely seems like he's been rejuvenated, and maybe if he came home to a very different scene, maybe that would be it as far as the divorce talk. Maybe.
Well, I thought he said he was never coming back earlier in the film.
That's what he did say. He
Yeah.
said, "I'm going to send for my clothes. I'm never coming back." You're right.
And then, of course, he comes back and he finds this. And again, for all of the Chet saving her life and saying how much he likes her and really like opening up and yeah, even articulating the themes of the movie to her, all of this, what seemed on its surface like the potential truest connection we've seen, Dickie comes home and bam, Chet is out the window and gone.
So was his good mood.
He was so happy a second ago. And then it's like just like that, for all that we've seen, for whatever journey the two of them may have gone on separately, it's like we're right back where we started. And once again, it's like on a dime it turns. And there was, after she slaps him, and in fairness, he had just thrown her against a wall. After she slaps him, there's this look on his face. He doesn't say anything, but for the first time, and he's a very, as I've stated a couple of times, John Marley's he's got a striking look, but that to me is the first time where he really, for a moment, looks sinister. And for me, at least, when I was watching it, it's like, yeah, he already threw her against a wall, and that's ugly and violent enough. But she slaps him a couple of times, and there's a moment where I, at least the first time I saw this, went, well, what is this guy going to do now? What other terrible act is he going to commit? And he doesn't. He goes to the kitchen, gets cigarettes, and they just sit on the stairs and they smoke together.
Like she was sitting with Chet and they were smoking together.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think it's interesting because, like, yeah, a lot of these people, like, they do things that are at best morally questionable. Occasionally they'll do something that is outright morally reprehensible. But there are, and I think this is true in the large majority of Cassavetes' work, there aren't heroes or villains. They're just people. They're just human beings like people do in reality, just people bumping into each other, wandering around, having experiences, trying to, like we said, answer these questions that maybe don't necessarily have answers, but that you feel on some level you need resolved to feel whole. Which is why, to come all the way back around, it's like, I think maybe what he's saying, if he's really saying anything, is that even being aware that something is wrong, that you are unhappy, that you do want resolution, that in and of itself is something fairly profound and not to be taken for granted.
Beautiful shot.
And yeah, it's like, we don't know what's going to happen. This marriage is going to continue, I assume, to not be particularly healthy. Maybe they'll stay together. Maybe they won't. Hopefully, separately or together, they can find some semblance of peace within themselves. But we know that they'll continue to be people, and they'll continue to just have these human experiences. And that's Faces, man. It's definitely not a brisk watch, for sure. I would suggest maybe if like many people, like I am frequently guilty of myself, if your attention span is want to wane, maybe best consumed with an intermission, like Bryon was able to create for himself.
I wouldn't call it an intermission, but I appreciate the support.
But yeah,
if we have the opportunity on Sunday to have Kevin sit in,
yeah,
which of course was what our whole process or our thought was. Hopefully we can go in a little bit deeper to some of this stuff, like when we were talking about husbands and some of the other stuff, because I kind of feel that this is where his real career began.
Absolutely.
Faces. Even though you were talking about some of the earlier stuff that he did, I think this is really the jumping off point, and obviously everything kind of falls from here. Maybe Kevin can give us some really good insight. He seems like he was pretty familiar with his work as well.
Yeah, if we can make that happen, that would be absolutely phenomenal. And if not on the show itself, that would be a great conversation to have with him at some point in the future. We're looking at the credits here, so we are going to wrap up. Any final thoughts from either one of you? And then also, where can people find you guys on the internet?
You can find me at Bryon Lee.
Me at Film Radar.
And I am all over social media at the Lex Michael. And join us on our next main Historic Hollywood show. We are going to be talking about Cassavetes and his career as a whole.
His entire career, and also as an actor as well.
Yes, so join us for that. And for all episodes of Historic Hollywood going forward, we will see you next week.
From producers Maria Menounos, Kevin Undergaro, Phil Svitek, and the entire Popcorn Talk Network, we would like to thank you for tuning in. For questions or comments, be sure to visit popcorntalk.com. I'm Sir Richard Wentworth, and this has been a presentation of the Popcorn Talk Network.
Views expressed herein are those of the hosts only and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Popcorn Talk Network or its owners or principals.
Like the beat, beat, beat of the tom-tom.